Glad to have you with us. I'm Joe Donlin.
And I'm Rudabeh Shabazi. Marnie is off tonight.
We begin this hour with breaking news. The U.S. Supreme Court just a short time ago rejecting a lawsuit filed by the state of Texas to try to overturn the results of the 2020 election.
The lawsuit aimed to toss out millions of votes in 4 battleground states: Georgia, Michigan, Pennsylvania, and Wisconsin.
And good evening again. I'm Rob Nelson. This is just the latest in a series of failed legal challenges from Republicans and the Trump campaign. We want to get straight to national political correspondent Dean Reynolds. He's live in the newsroom tonight with the very latest. Dean.
Rob, even though attorneys general from 18 states supported the long shot effort to overturn the election results in Pennsylvania, Wisconsin, Michigan, and Georgia, ultimately their number didn't matter because the highest court in the land was just not buying what they were selling. Late today, the justices denied the lawsuit, ruling that Texas has not demonstrated a judicially cognizable interest in the manner in which another state conducts its election. In other words, elections in other states were not the business of Texas. It was the second setback this week for the Trump campaign at the hands of the justices, who earlier rejected a similar request regarding the results of Pennsylvania alone. The Texas lawsuit argued that widespread fraud and irregularities in 4 states, Wisconsin, Michigan, Pennsylvania, and Georgia, had somehow burdened the people of Texas and left the results in those states so tainted they should be overturned. If it had somehow succeeded, those states and their 62 electoral votes could have been taken away from Joe Biden and awarded to President Trump. If that happened, the president would win a second term. But the case relied on many of the same claims: stuffed ballot boxes, corrupted machines, late-night vote drops, all made in lawsuits across the land that judges have tossed out of court over the last month. Still, 18 attorneys general supported the lawsuit, and more than 100 Republican congressmen signed on as well. Though by extension, the suit cast doubt on their elections too. Republican Tim Walberg of Michigan was one of them.
I don't accept that Joe Biden won anything yet until we've exhausted all the resources that are legal.
Those states whose elections were being questioned attacked the lawsuit. Pennsylvania's Attorney General Josh Shapiro called the effort a seditious abuse of the judicial process. Now, President Trump had said this lawsuit was the big one, the one that everyone has been waiting for. Well, the waiting is over, and the nation's highest court has blocked yet another legal path for him to overturn the election he lost. Rudabeh?
Dean, thank you. The Wisconsin Supreme Court has agreed to hear the Trump administration's challenge to that state's election results. The decision comes just hours after a lower court judge rejected the president's lawsuit seeking to throw out more than 221,000 ballots in that state. The circuit court judge ruled that the election was properly administered and there was no evidence of wrongdoing. The state Supreme Court will hear arguments in the case tomorrow. President-elect Biden won Wisconsin by more than 20,000 votes.
Joining us now is constitutional law expert Paul Lisnik. Paul, let's start with today's case. 4 states that were in question here basically said mind your own business, and it sounds like the Supreme Court agreed, saying Texas didn't have standing.
Yeah, Joe, that's exactly it. The legal grounds was the Supreme Court saying, look, in order to have standing, you have to have what's called injury. You have to have, say, somehow you are aggrieved by what has happened here. And the reason this case started in the Supreme Court is because it was one state suing another state. Those cases begin in the Supreme Court. But the Supreme Court looked at this and just go, even with original jurisdiction here, you just don't have a right to complain about what other states are doing based on Article 3 rights. They can set up their own election system. That's what they've done, and you're not injured by that, so this case is gone.
But they could, the Trump campaign, say that the basic question still hasn't been answered for them, right? They're saying we don't have standing. They're saying there are still issues here.
You are right that the court didn't even reach the merits because the court said we don't need to. Interesting, along those lines, Justice Alito and Justice Thomas issued a separate sentence where, as part of this order, where they said, you know, we would have at least listened to what you had to say, but it went on to say, but we would not have granted you any relief here. So essentially, what the court is saying is a couple of things. Not only is there no standing, but they went on to say these issues are moot. This election is done. The other thing is, since the general gripe here was really not, as much as you hear about about fraud, on television and the arguments they make. That's not what they were alleging in the lawsuit. Essentially, what they were saying here is we, Texas, don't really like what happened in these other states. There's something called the generalized grievance, which means if you can say, we don't think this is right, and there's a lot of people who agree with us, the court still says, we don't hear those cases. And finally, if the argument is, we think that Pennsylvania and these other states just didn't do it right, they need to change their election laws, that's called a political question, and the court doesn't hear those either. They send them back to what they think is a more appropriate branch. In this case, they would have said, let Congress deal with it if they want to create a federal system.
The president, Paul, has wanted to get a case to the Supreme Court. He thought it would be favorable. Obviously, he has 3 appointees on it. We had the other case earlier this week involving Pennsylvania. Have we learned anything about where the justices are on these?
Well, what we know is that the 3 Trump appointee justices, they did not dissent. So I think President Trump may have thought on some level that, hey, I appointed them, and that's the way things work in the world. They'll do me a favor. But as we know, when justices or judges don't operate that way. Once they're on the bench and they're in their position, they basically work with the law. And so pretty much every case, this is over from a legal perspective. With tonight's decision and previous decisions, this is legally over, but it's not the end of the game.
Well, what's next then? What is the end of the game? We know the electoral votes will be cast by states on Monday, and then there's another big date on January 6th, right?
And that's the end of the game. On January 6th, there's what's generally a sort of a pro forma meeting. It is a joint session of Congress. The Senate and the House get together, and they present the electors and do the final count. That meeting is presided over by the vice president, and if everybody does what they should do, then in the end, Joe Biden would be announced president. As a matter of historical note, back in 2000, there were Democrats who complained about the Florida electors. That's where the problems were in 2000 in Bush v. Gore. And when they started to say, we object to the Florida count, Vice President Gore, who at that time oversaw that procedure, said no. He shut it down and said, I will not listen to that. George W. Bush will be the next president of the United States, and he's to be congratulated. Well, this time, Vice President Pence will be running that meeting. And you can be assured that since you had, over 100 congressmen sign on to this petition, my guess is that you will have some congressmen who will object to the electoral counts of these states. If they get even one senator to object, there will have to be, the sessions will have to split off. The Senate, the House, they will meet. They will have to make decisions as to whether they accept the votes. You can acknowledge the fact that the House will accept the count. We don't know what the Senate will do, but if there's a distinction, one says yes, one says no, it actually has to go to the 4 state governors for final decision. Game's not over yet.
Yeah, one more political question for you, Paul. Despite the legal losses, do you think Republicans who are watching this unfold in the court will accept these decisions by even the Supreme Court as saying that there weren't any irregularities or fraud? Or do you think, as we've seen in recent polls, that 70% of Republicans think there were definitely irregularities and that this win is not legitimate for Joe Biden?
Well, I think that Republicans outside of Congress, just people, there are 70% of Republicans who generally look at this and just believe that the president wasn't given a fair election, and that's what the president says, and his supporters are very devoted to him. Members of Congress, they know differently than that. They do know that there really has been no evidence of fraud. Whether you believe there was or not, there has been no evidence presented to the courts of fraud in this distinction. And both Trump-appointed justices and Trump-appointed judges at the lower courts have basically unanimously found no fraud here. So really, I think what's behind the members of Congress's action is they're up for re-election in 2022. They want to know that this president, who will still be very influential, is still in their court. The president made a comment just the other night, which basically, or one of his staffers did. He's watching to see which members of Congress are standing behind him. Basically, this is members of Congress wanting to stand on the good side of the president, but they realistically know this lawsuit had no chance.
All right, Paul Lisnek, thank you as always for your time. We appreciate it. Good to see you.